we're going to shift gears just a little bit from fish to something other, some other thing that's green and flows, money. So I want to present Appendix F, which is on the economic costs of and adaptations for alternative delta regulations. This study was done by the main workhorse on this was Stacy Tanaka, former PhD student at Davis, Christina Connell, Kama Madani, myself, Alan Hannock, and with some wonderful help on more than one occasion by Josue Medellin, who's here today, and Richard Howitt, who's going to be here tomorrow. This slide is the same one I had up before. It shows that the delta is not just the delta; it's connected to everything else. Right? This is the blessing and the curse of the delta. This is the reason why so many people throw resources and expertise at it, is because it's connected to everything else. But it's a curse because if you're going to do anything here, all these other people you're going to talk to, and by the time you finish that conversation, you're old and gray, if you're that lucky. So here in Delta's got a very important role within California's water system. What we want to look at here is the economic effects of reducing water exports. So there's going to be this series of studies on that. We want to look also at the effects on the rest of this California water system of increasing net delta outflow. So this isn't looking at all ranges of all kinds of things that we've talked about, but just a few of them. And then we want to look at some at a comparison of these different types of delta regulations, either delta regulations that reduce delta exports or that reduce delta outflow. So in all of this, in contrast with all the other talks that you've heard today, we don't care about what's happening inside the delta. We really care about what's happening outside the delta. Okay. So if you ask me about the dispersion coefficients around Ship's Island, it doesn't matter. This model, don't see any of it. We want to talk also in terms of this about some of the employment impacts in the region, particularly down here in the San Joaquin and Tulare basins, and then we'll have some conclusions. The central sort of modeling on this is different than hydrodynamic modeling. It's different than the principal components analyses that Bill did, and it's different than that highly complex and completely truthful Moyle model that we spent a lot of time last hour talking about. This is the Calvin model, and for those of you who haven't suffered through a Calvin model presentation yet, I'll give you just a few slides on it. Calvin model, it's a model of the entire statewide water system. Those slides had a schematic on it. That's a schematic of this model superimposed on a map of California. It's really designed for integrated water management. It's got all the reservoirs, all the major reservoirs in their operation, groundwater and surface water, conjunctive use operations, groundwater use, all the groundwater storage in the main intertide California water system. Water conservation, particularly represented economically in terms of if you have less water, what's the scarcity costs to the water users, both agricultural and urban water users. Has wastewater reuse and the costs for wastewater reuse. It has seawater desalinization and some representation of costs for desalinization. And it allows water markets. As a matter of fact, it allows all the water markets that people want to have. You have to tell it not to do water marketing, just like you have to tell it not to do conjunctive use. It'll do as much of that as is economically, as the model sees as economically worthwhile. This work, the one operating rule for this operations model, essentially planning model, is it optimizes statewide economic benefits, net economic benefits statewide. So it has all of these economic costs for water deliveries to agricultural and urban areas, hydropower values for hydropower production, pumping costs, treatment costs, some representation of costs for extra salts going down to the metropolitan area in Southern California, things like that. We've got a whole bunch of papers and reports that have come out of this, sort of highly reviewed in that sense. You'll also realize that the Calvin model has sort of two personalities. It has sort of the mischievous 5-year-old, and I like this cartoon because this is the ultimate big picture model for California water, I think. And it has this sort of religious reformer personality, where We're trying to incite some discipline in how we look at water management in California, with some sort of strict discipline to how it's done. It's sort of schizophrenic, but it works. Just to show you the kinds of things that are put together in this model in a very spatially distributed way for California water modeling anyway, it's got essentially a representation of the surface and groundwater hydrology in California, which we can change for climate studies. It has a representation of the major physical facilities and their capacities and their geometric arrangements throughout California. Environmental flow constraints, we have required environmental flows in this model. And they're represented as constraints. So as someone observed in one of our early presentations on the Calvin model, the environment gets its water first, because that's a requirement for the optimization. And then it has economic values for urban water users, agricultural water users that rely on another, perhaps even more complex model called SWAP that Josue Medin and Richard Howitt will talk about tomorrow. And operating costs, pumping, treatment, all kinds of things. All this goes into a set of databases along with metadata that documents where the data comes from. And then this database is used to run the optimization code, HECPRM, for the Army Corps of Engineers. And out of it comes all kinds of wonderful things. This is a model that combines an engineering model of water management with an economics model of water management, essentially. And so from that hybrid model, you get a lot of economic insights into engineering operations and a lot of economic insights into capacity expansion, things and the like, as well as some economic insights into the engineering side of things as well. So I really like all of this. Some examples here are you can look at and very quickly get a set of preliminary economic benefits of alternatives. It automatically does conjunctive use and cooperative operations. So you have to tell it not to cooperate to the extent that you don't want to have economically useful cooperation occurring. It gives you willingness to pay for additional water supply and water reliability. It gives you all the traditional engineering things in terms of water delivery water operations, delivery reliabilities, value of more flexible operations as you change the constraints on the system, and something that people sometimes find of value and sometimes find to their dislike. It tells you an estimate of the value of increasing facility capacities, both increasing or decreasing the capacity of storage or conveyance facilities in the system, or treatment plants and recharge operations. So it's a terrible model, but it gives you some insights that we don't have otherwise. Here's the model coverage. Here again is the schematic of the model superimposed on the state of California. And then for the agricultural areas, we have 25, or what is it up to now, Josue? The current, I think these results we have, what, 25 regions still, right?
26 regions, 21 in the Central Valley, plus Imperial, Coachella, Palo Verde, and Ventura, and San Diego.
Okay. But we don't have Santa Clara in this model yet. Okay. But anyway, it gives you quite a lot. This model has been applied to a whole bunch of different things since 2001. Restoring Hetch Hetchy, you might have read about that in the Sacramento Bee. That was the smallest model runs we ever did with this model, and it's probably gotten the most publicity. We've got a model run that's just about to be submitted, where we take a look at a paleo drought hitting California and what the system would do to adapt to 75 years of about 40% of mean annual flow. Really kind of amazing things. Josue here has made a version of this model for Baja California called Baja Calvin. And certainly a lot of the delta studies that we've done in the last couple of years. Does this model work? Just like what Bill did with the hydrodynamics model, it's always useful to sort of step back and say, how does this model work, and where's it bad, where's it good? I've been really shocked at how good this model seems to work. That's not to say it's a perfect model, because it ain't. It's a lousy model. It's just better than anything else we could get our hands on. From the 2001 model runs we did, those 2000 model runs predicted a number of water transfers, most of which have occurred or are well along the way in negotiations. Now, some of these, like the Imperial San Diego transfers, are still in discussion, I can say, but they probably will be for some time. But I think they're well underway. It's not because the people saw the model results and said, "Oh, that's what we should do." It's because California has a lot of smart people running the water system, and they're always looking out for these kind of opportunities as well. My favorite one on this list of things that the 2001 model predicted that are actually occurring is this intertie between Contra Costa Water District and East Bay Mud. When we first presented this, boy, did I get ribbed by folks from Contra Costa and East Bay Mud. How dare anyone think that they could cooperate? And now I understand that, courtesy of CalFed funding, they have a functioning intertie. It's just so nice to see that in retrospect. And a bunch of other things that have gone out pretty well from this model. Certainly this is not a perfect model. There is no such thing. It's only a model. It's wrong, but it's sometimes useful. So let's look, applying this to the deltas problems. Look at the delta model runs that we made for this system. There's really kind of two problems for, so far as the outside world looking in at this delta problem, if you don't care about what's happened inside the delta. One is exports from the delta. To what degree are exports from the delta in and of themselves problematic for the fish? If exports themselves are problematic, that has implications for one set of implications for how you manage the rest of the water system. The other aspect of the delta's problem, so looking at it from the far outside, would be reductions in net or increases in changes in net delta outflow. To the extent that you want more net delta outflow from the system to affect salinity or to affect variability in the system, that also has implications for the whole state. Operationally, they can be quite different, and we'll have some model results that I think show that. So what we've done here is, what I'll show today is a set of runs that reduce and end water exports, okay, keeping net delta outflows as they happen to be. At least that's what they are now, perhaps more. The second set of model runs steadily increases net delta outflows without necessarily reducing exports. It says, the second set of runs says, we're going to force the state of California, with all the water users in California, to increase net delta outflows, and we don't care how that net increase in outflows occurs. It can come from reducing exports. It can come from reducing upstream diversions. Okay, we don't care. So long as we get it, we don't care where it comes from. What's the economically best way to get it? The first one says, first set of runs is going to reduce export capacities. Say, okay, we're going to reduce the size of the pipe, the quantity of the rate at which you can export water from the delta, and we're going to see what that does to aggregate water performance in the state of California. These sets of runs are both for year 2050 kinds of conditions, and we're going to look at both water deliveries and shortages, water scarcity costs to the water users, so the cost to the water users of not getting all the water they would like to receive, operating costs, and then the mix of water management decisions that occur locally and regionally along with this. And then for the no exports case, we'll also look at regional employment impacts and regional economic impact. So this first set is just for reducing water exports. And this is going to respond to problems with in-delta intakes. So if you're going to take water through the delta or around the delta, it doesn't matter here. If you've got problems at the intakes to whatever conveyance system is sending water south, and you want to reduce water exports as a way of reducing that particular effect, what will it do to the rest of the system? So what we have here is a reduction with each of these runs. So here we have a base case with about 5 or 6 million acre feet per year of exports total. We have a 50% reduction in capacity. That's the rate capacity. That's not the total volume of water exported. Then we have a 75% reduction in the rate capacity of delta exports, and then we have no exports, which is zero either in rate capacity or in volume. Okay. So what happens as you make these reductions? So as you reduce average delta exports in terms of thousands of acre feet per year, what you see is small increases in water scarcity to urban areas, much larger scarcities, particularly at first, to agriculture. And then when you go to no exports from, say, 75% reduction, then the urban guys get hit pretty hard as well. So this is in terms of average ag scarcity. And note this is very interesting and important, I think. This is the agricultural scarcity on the left-hand axis. This is the urban scarcity on the right-hand axis. Okay, that tells you two things. One is the economics really doesn't like to short urban areas. And the other thing is there's a whole lot more agricultural water demand than urban water demand, even for your 2050 conditions. Okay, so agriculture gets it first, as you probably would expect. The cost of this, you can break this down into scarcity costs, which is the costs of water users not receiving all the water they would like. For farmers, that reduces their amount of agricultural production. We can estimate their losses of profit. For urban areas, it means houses have to go through more frequent water rationing and things like that. That has an economic value that you can assign to it. The operating costs include all the pumping, treatment, desalination, wastewater reuse costs, those kinds of things. So we go from base case, small reduction, or modest, good reduction in flow capacity, moderate reduction in export volume, more reductions, no exports, and then, okay, so no exports. With no exports, between that and base case, we have, under the pure case, about a $1.5 billion per year increase in statewide economic costs in the water sector. This comes mostly from increased water scarcity to agriculture because the urban areas have bought up much of the remaining water available south of the delta and tried to ship it south. There's also a fair bit of wastewater reuse, a little bit of desalination, some more urban water scarcity. But most of the water scarcity is in agriculture. And then we thought, maybe that's a little too optimistic. So we wanted to have a range. As you'll see when we get to Appendix J, we wanted to have a range in costs because you shouldn't really believe one number in any of this stuff. But so this was a pretty optimistic range. This assumes a perfect water markets. Everybody can get along. We can negotiate these things a lot more easily than we've been able to do down in Imperial lately. So I think this is a good optimistic estimate of how low the water scarcity costs could be. But we thought, well, that's really kind of a lower bound. What should we do for an upper bound? And so we said, well, let's not allow folks in the Tulare Basin to sell water south. So the folks down in Southern California, urban areas there, are no longer allowed to buy additional water from the Tulare Basin. And when we did that, the cost goes up from $1.5 billion per year to $2.2 billion per year. So, fairly substantial increase. This again assumes that with that restriction in transfers here, we're allowing all kinds of other things to happen without transaction cost and without impediments. So what you'll see when we get to Appendix J is we said, well, that isn't really the upper bound. The upper bound, let's add another $300 million a year. Just costs of friction in the system. So that's our no export costs. It's almost as sophisticated as the fish model. What can I say? This, I think, shows hope maybe this will be interesting to you. Well, later in Appendix J, you'll see that it becomes important that we estimate for any amount of export reduction, how much economic loss do we see? And we want to scale that by percentage. So if we have a 20% export reduction, how much of the no export cost do we see as cost? Okay, if we all behaved sort of uniformly and randomly, we might say, well, if you give me 20% less water, I'm going to have 20% of the no export costs. But that if we're smart people, we don't operate that way. If you're going to be, if you're a farmer and you're reduced by 20% in terms of your water deliveries, are you going to cut all your crops equally? No. you're going to save your most profitable crops. You're going to cut your least profitable crops on the worst soils. So one of the things we want to do here is estimate this nonlinearity between export reductions and economic loss. And so when we have that 50% reduction in export capacity and 75% reduction in export capacity, we're going to use that to sort of calibrate a curve here that says how fast does economic loss respond to export reduction costs. So that very first bit of export reduction doesn't cost you so much, but that last bit, it costs you a heck of a lot. Okay. So I just want to put that in here because we'll use that tomorrow. Now you've all seen it, and you'll be ready for the test. Water management adaptation. What do these guys do when you cut off all their water? Okay, so here is south of the delta with the base case, and south of the delta with no exports, just to look at with an unfettered water market. So this is without restricting the water transfers. In the ideal case, what do people do? Where do they get their water? So you can see surface water and groundwater south of the delta. Water scarcity is about 8%, 8.6%. That's the percent of the total water demand that you just don't receive because of droughts and unavailability of water. Westlands has some of that, I think, almost as a permanent condition. There's some agricultural reuse. That's water that was applied to the fields, and the return flows is now available to somebody else downstream. It's a big, big valley. There's a lot of that goes on, a couple percent in this case. I actually think that number probably seems low, but we can maybe look into that some more. And then we have some wastewater reuse and desalinization. I think in this case it's all wastewater reuse of urban wastewater, very small percentage. When we cut off all exports, we see the scarcity grow from 8.6% to almost 25%. So 25% of water demands, they're not happening. And we'll see a little bit later that a lot of that's disproportionately in many of the agricultural areas. It's not hitting the urban areas nearly to that degree. It's very unevenly distributed. Surface water, of course, goes down. There's a lot. You've got 6 million acre-foot less water going south. Groundwater pumping a little bit less because you also have less surface water going into groundwater. Agricultural reuse goes down because you've got less agricultural use. Recycling, wastewater reuse predominantly is in this. A little bit of seawater desalination goes up to about 3.7% of all the water use south of the delta. And south of the delta, and I should also add, this includes the Bay Area. What does this do to the regional employment impact? So this is in the southern Central Valley. I want to focus mostly down here on the jobs. So under the base case, there's about 600,000 jobs in the agricultural economy here. It goes down to 500,000, so about 100,000 jobs are lost. This is sort of the multiplier effect of this. So you might not think that $1.5 billion a year is a lot, but certainly if you're one of those 103,000 people, it'll seem like a lot to you. In terms of crop income, $4.4 billion. Water scarcity cost, that's $800 million per year. 20%, 26% less agriculture irrigated acreage down there. And 29% less water delivery. This is not evenly distributed, so this is the whole state. Since I know you've remembered the map that I had at the very beginning that had all the numbered agricultural regions, let me just point out that the top one here, number 1, is in the north of the valley, and number 21 is the very south end of the Central Valley. So up here we have the Sacramento Valley, and you'll notice that without exports, we have some positive numbers here. So there's more water, a little more water available in the Sacramento Valley, and we'll see a little bit of that later on when we see crop production. But it's very little. It adds just a few $1 million of crop revenue in the Sacramento Valley. The exchange contractors, so these are on the west side of the San Joaquin River. They lose half of their water deliveries. I don't know where they get the rest of it, actually. We should look into that. How are they going to get any water? There must be some means. Maybe they're taking out of groundwater for a while, at least. The east side of the San Joaquin Valley. Notice this is in yellow. I'm going to Jeff's three-color scheme here. So green is good, red is bad, yellow is eh. So east side of the San Joaquin Valley, where do they get their water from? They get their water from New Don Pedro, Merced River, Stanislaus River. They're not affected by ending water exports. They have their peripheral canal already. It's called their reservoirs, right, in the Sierra. So they're hardly affected at all. So they do pretty much okay. Westlands, that's in the red, almost 60% loss of water. Eastern side of the Tulare Basin, now that's in yellow again, and they're losing more water than the east side of the San Joaquin Valley, but not as much as Westlands and the exchange contractors. Why is that? They're getting water from Friant, and this is still water that they haven't sold all their water. If they hadn't sold water to Metropolitan, they'd be more like the East San Joaquin Valley. Okay. So they see some shortages. And then we see the western and southern Tulare basins, again, coming back up to these pretty substantial 30% to almost 80% water shortages. So it's very unevenly distributed, at least from the economics. Any questions so far? Hope is this making sense? Is this too techy? Okay. Now, Josue and Richard took some of these results and they ran it through the SWAP model. This is the more detailed model of agricultural production in the Central Valley and in the state. And we wanted to break out for the San Joaquin Valley, which Josue, this San Joaquin Valley, that includes Tulare Basin, right? Okay. So it's southern Central Valley. Okay, so this is really San Joaquin Valley and the Tulare Basin. You can see the base case acreages for these different crops out of the SWAP model, and then for no exports, and then what happens in terms of acreages in the San Joaquin Valley and the southern Central Valley, and then also statewide. So for alfalfa, we lose about 31% of the acreage in this southern Central Valley area, about 20% of it statewide. Green is, well, it's not good, but it's better. Citrus, higher value crop, we lose about 3%, 2 or 3%. Cotton, field crops, grains, back in the red zone. Cotton, notice here, 36.7%, 36.7%. Almost all of that, all of the cotton is grown in this region in California, as you'd expect. Field crops here, big reduction. Grains, big reduction, huge reduction in the San Joaquin Valley. Much less, but still quite substantial statewide. Orchards, not affected very much. Affected, certainly, but not nearly so much. Pasture, kind of in the middle. Raisins. Decreases a little bit both places. I guess a lot of the raisins must be grown in the Central Valley. Rice. Now notice rice. This is interesting. In the San Joaquin Valley, you lose 17% of your rice acreage, but look at statewide. An increase of 0.3%. That's that low-value water that we now have more of in the Sacramento Valley. There it is, popping right up in the model. Isn't that model wonderful? SWAP is just great. My own model is lousy, but Richard's is great. Sugar beets, table grapes, not much effect there. Again, you can see farmers keeping the high-value crops, getting rid of the low-value stuff. If you want to look at contrast the red with the green is where the money is. The red is the money-losing crops. Apparently the tomatoes as well, which is a little bit of a surprise. Truck crops, wine grapes, so don't worry about the wine too much. It'll be a little bit less of it, a little more expensive, but not too bad. Overall, 26% less agricultural acreage in the southern Central Valley, 15% statewide. Well, that's a big impact. But when you look at it from the whole statewide economy, maybe it's not so large, because agriculture is only about 5% of the statewide economy. Okay, so that's ending exports. For increasing net delta outflows, here what we've done is we've allowed exports to continue as we increase net delta outflow with water purchased upstream. So if if the state is requiring, if the State Water Control Board, those evil people over there, are requiring that more water goes out through the delta, we're going to say, well, you exporters, if you still want to export water, you can go buy water from someplace else. And then you can export along your merry way. And that's what the model will allow. It's allowing that trading to occur. And we've increased, the way we've increased net delta outflows is we've increased the minimum monthly delta outflow. So what we've done here, here's a series of bars here. For October, the first bar is the base case. And you can see the required delta outflow currently in October is this fairly low level, and there's some surplus delta outflow that occurs here. In the second bar, what we've done is we've increased the minimum delta outflow to this new level. And we've applied that across all months. And that reduces the surplus. And then we keep on increasing that lower bar across all months until by this last bar, there's essentially no surplus delta outflow. And the next model run wouldn't work because it was infeasible. There was no mathematical solution that would allow you to have that delta outflow. So what you can see here in, say, January, February, March, is as we increase the net minimum delta outflow, we are decreasing surplus until there ain't no more. And you can see it shifts surpluses from some months to other months as it's trying to do this. So if you think the delta needs to have more fresh water going out, this is a set of runs to let you look at the statewide economic impact of that. So as we increase the required delta outflows from base case levels to higher and higher levels, you can see the agricultural scarcity is going up first, and then you see a little bit of increase in urban scarcity until the very last bit. And again, you can notice the difference in scales between urban and agricultural, almost 2 orders of magnitude. Because the model's just trying to save money. That's all it's trying to do. We can look, so this is in terms of scarcity. In terms of the cost of that scarcity, you can see the agricultural scarcity going like this, and then the urban scarcity cost going up like this on the same scale. Our current required delta outflow is about 6 million acre-feet per year. I think our current average net delta outflow is about 13 million acre-feet per year. Looking at that in terms of costs, here again we have a breakdown between scarcity costs and operating costs. Again, operating costs on average are pretty high, although droughts it can reverse. You can see it's fairly gentle at the beginning because people are doing the inexpensive stuff. You're following the inexpensive, lower value crops and things like that, and then when you get the more high value crops getting shorted and then greater urban shortages, you get to see this kick way up. Here are these pie charts in terms of, here I wanted to have both the north of delta plots up here in the north and the south of delta plots here below. So in the base case, with surface water deliveries is most of it, groundwater, a little bit of scarcity in the north, slight bit of recycling, really no desalination here, agricultural reuse of water, and then when you have this huge delta outflow, I wanted to pick something dramatic here. Basically, very little surface water left, groundwater pumping, much less reuse, a little more desalination, a lot of scarcity. We're getting up against the physical limits of what you can do here. Now contrast this to the no export case, where when we had no exports, these guys had more water. For here they have less, because they're selling it south. They have less water, more money. In Southern California, south of the Delta anyway, south of the Delta, which includes the Bay Area, by the way. Here's the mix now. There's that about 8% scarcity. And then with huge amount of increase in delta outflow, we have about a 31% scarcity. Surface water deliveries, some of these are purchased from Northern California. Any questions? Okay. So now let's compare these two strategies for regulation. One on restricting exports and one on increasing delta outflows. Here we're going to look at this in terms of the average delta outflow on one axis. So here we are now at about 13 million acre-feet per year. when we end, and this is going to be in terms of average net costs, $1 billion per year. When we end delta exports, we get to close to 19 million acre feet per year of average delta outflows. It costs us a little more than $4 billion a year, a 1.5 billion increase over the base. If we were really interested in increasing net delta outflow, however, and our problem wasn't with the amount exported, we would say, wait a minute, why don't we just increase the net delta outflow and let those guys, the exporters, buy some water out of the north? And we could lower the economic costs here by, what is that, by about $1 billion a year. So you're reducing the cost of getting that 19 million acre feet per year average outflow from being $1.5 billion to being about $500 million. That should give you some real money to do something. You know, if you want to do something for fish or compensation to agricultural economies in Northern California or something like that. Similarly, but reversing this in a similar way, we can look at average delta exports, the average cost if we achieve reductions in exports by reducing exports directly or by increasing the minimum outflow. Because if we increase the minimum outflow, we can induce an effect of reducing exports. And we can see here that that's a much less efficient way to do it, as you might think about. But we can quantify that cost as well. So if you want to reduce delta exports to this level, to say 2.5 million acre feet, you can do that by increasing minimum delta outflows rather than doing it directly, and that only costs you an extra $1.5 billion extra. So not a really smart idea here. So I guess one of the conclusions of this will be to regulate exports based on your objectives in terms of total outflow from the delta and the direct effects of exports, either exports as they affect through the delta as they affect flows within the delta. Maybe that might be one reason why you might want to target export reduction and not outflow reduction, or exports as they might affect with a peripheral canal flows on the Sacramento River. So some mix of those things is probably what you want to do, but it's very different. So conclusions. Overall, ending exports is possible, but it's costly. It's $1.5 to $2.3 plus billion per year. Ending exports is not catastrophic statewide. If you compare to $1.5 or $2.5 billion per year to a statewide economy of $1.5 trillion a year, we will not dry up and blow away. We might dry up, but we won't blow away. However, this is really bad for the southern Central Valley agricultural economy. It's a lot of jobs there. Shortages are felt more by agriculture as the cities buy all they can. Larger shortages get the cities too. Water conservation, wastewater reuse, seawater desalination help some in all of this. Reducing exports is an economically costly way to increase net delta outflows. So if you think that the delta needs more fresh water going all the way out, reducing exports is not the most efficient way to do it. The governance issues, the legal issues involved in doing that, I think, are hard, but we have hopefully some loyalty to the statewide economy here. And by doing these regulations inefficiently, what we're essentially doing is reducing the economic surplus available for all kinds of purposes in California, our own enjoyment, the fish, the state budget deficits, whatever else. So questions. Oh, and this is one of my favorite slides to end with. You get to guess what this map is. 1983. This is the 1982 vote on the peripheral canal. So for those that like our report too much, I always like to put this in to show what a steep problem this is. Yes?
So I guess the first question that comes to my mind on the last slide was you mentioned that conservation measures, are marginally helpful. Was it surprising to you to find that it was only marginally helpful? I mean, with all the noise people are saying about the need for conservation and reuse and all that, why did it not end up being a larger factor in what you could do?
I think probably a couple of reasons. One is I would like to have a better representation, particularly of urban water conservation, than what we have now. I think the representation we have of agricultural water conservation is about as good as we can do. Josue's more knowledgeable on this. Certainly Richard tomorrow is a good person to ask on this, on the agricultural side. On the urban side, I think we have a very primitive representation of urban water economics, urban water costs of water conservation, things like that. I'd say it's primitive because I'd like to have it a lot better. I think it's more sophisticated than what anybody else has. But I know it can be done better. It'll just take some work and some thought. The other thing that I think is almost a popular myth now is there's actually in water conservation a tremendous difference between conserving applied water and conserving consumptive use. And when you're in a place like the Central Valley where the water you apply that is not consumptively used is often used downstream. If you're conserving applied water but not consumptive use, you're not really conserving water. Maybe you're just spending money. I mean, there's often some other benefits, but sometimes it's not efficient to conserve applied water. So an example I sometimes like to give is, and I don't want to get into a big ideological debate about it, but if someone in Reading puts in a low-flow toilet, how much good does that do to the Central Valley in terms of water availability? Not much, because the extra 2, 3, 4, 5 gallons that their old toilet used per flush, it was going to go all the way through anyway. You know, it's the classic flush twice, it's a long way to L.A. There's that aspect to it. What you do save is locally. You save energy costs, treatment costs, things like that in the local water utility, in the local service area. So I don't want to discount all the benefits of conserving applied water, but in the Central Valley, you got to be careful what you're talking about. Is it real water or is it paper water in a sense? Now, if you put a low flush toilet in San Francisco, then it counts because that's an extra 3, 4, 5 gallons you're not taking out of Hetch Hetchy. That's available for use somebody else. So there, in San Francisco, changing out that toilet, the applied water reduction is the same as a consumptive use reduction. In Reading, it's not. In Sacramento, it's not.
I have a kind of a similar question on desal. I'm kind of surprised that desal didn't play a bigger role in this.
Money.
Yeah, and one of the issues is cost, and I know that there's been a lot of progress made in desal in the last few years, and the costs have come down quite a bit. Is that factored into the model?
Yes and no. I had my students read a paper from 1966 the other day. It was a really wonderful report from the National Academy by Gilbert White, and about the future of water strategy in America and all those kinds of things. And in there, there's a little section that I had forgotten about until the students reminded me, saying that really desalinization costs were coming down quite rapidly. In any decade now, we would all the coastal cities would have an infinite supply of cheap water. It reminds me of something I've heard said about solar power, that solar energy is a promising technology, and it might always be. And so while seawater desalination costs have come down quite a lot, certainly they've come down to the point where you can use it on a boat. People will buy it for their coastal things, and if you have a hotel, you'll do it. They have some occasions in Europe where it's used, in Israel, Middle East where it's used. If you have no other alternatives and you have a highly valued water use, sure, you'll do it. It's the costs range. The numbers that I've seen are between $1,400 and $2,500 an acre foot. When you back out all the subsidies and everything, that seems to be in those ranges. In our model, we assume about $2,000 an acre foot. So, if it came down a little bit, you might see a little bit more of it. But even at $1,500 an acre foot, even at $1,000 an acre foot, it's no panacea. It's still way more expensive than the price of water from Metropolitan Water District. So it'll always be a use of last resort. What you would get with cheaper desal in the short run, unless it's way, way cheaper, is a little bit of reduction in water scarcity, and maybe a reduction. Yeah, that's probably what you mostly get.
I think I disagree. I think Met's price is going up really fast.
Well, yeah, but how long will it take for? Anyway.
Yeah,
I don't think we're there yet. Certainly
we're
not
not there yet.
We got a ways to go, and I don't want to. And we have some bizarre, but to me seem bizarre worries about brine disposal and things like that. That I think will also be additional impediments to
Did you
installing
include
these
brackish
technologies.
water desalination?
No,
Desalination?
no, we don't have that.
So that was just included as
regular water
regular
for the most
water.
part.
What did you assume for the amount that you could conserve? I mean, the governor's established this goal of 20% by 2020 for urban users. Do you remember, have any idea what your assumptions were? And you're right, not all of it's consumptive, but
Right.
on the coast, much of it is.
Yes, I think we see, and I've already admitted that I think our representation of urban water demands is primitive, probably on the order of 10% or so. Josue, does that sound about right? Something like that. I mean, maybe we can eke some more out of it, and I'm sure we can. I don't think we'll get 50% out easily, although, I have to sort of take a step back. I have a graduate student that did a lot of really great work on water demand in Jordan, where their per capita water use is 50 liters per capita per day, or 100 liters per capita per day if it's well off. So, and in Northern Europe, the standard for urban water supply is 210 liters per capita per day. Well, we're 4 times that at least here. So, I'm sure on the urban side we can do a lot of conservation that, at least in terms of applied water, and even in consumptive use, because half of our water use is for landscape irrigation.
Oh, and the one other thing on desalination, Poseidon, I think the 50,000 acre foot project they're doing, they're selling the water for the Met price plus 150.
Uh-huh.
And I think they're breaking even, and they assume that the cost of Met water will go up enough so that they will make,
That could
money.
be.
I mean,
It
if
could
private
be.
investors are willing to put $285 million, I think, on the line,
Might be a lost leader.
it's a big loss
It
leader.
is. But
is.
Poseidon's had some trouble, I think, in Tampa Bay too. So
They did.
Yeah.
They did.
I mean, that's one thing that scares me a little bit about it. When I've looked at desal plants in Europe, they only work because they had an 85% subsidy of the capital cost from the European Union. Sure, that makes it easy.
Yeah, I guess my experience, just sorry, I don't mean to dominate, but I actually was involved in the very first brackish water desalter in Southern California. And when we built that, it did require a subsidy to get built and an operational subsidy for probably 10 years. But at the end of 10 years, it turned around to the point where we could double the size of it and not have any subsidy at all. And I think there are now 6 or 7 brackish water desalters in urban Southern California that now make economic sense and require little, if any, subsidy. So my sense is, yeah, there are still problems, and brine disposal is still a problem. There are a lot of problems, but scarcity will drive.
It might happen. I hesitate to put.
And ocean desalination is different.
I'm perfectly comfortable with brackish water desalination. I think the economics of that are proved out pretty well.
But 20 years ago, people were making the same arguments about that.
This is true. I mean, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have expected the internet to be what it is today, too. So, but I hesitate in modeling to put, water bags and, at what point do I quit? I could have water bags, I could have icebergs. Anyway. I got to try to put modeling things in there that I think can be done, not things that hopefully can be done.
Following on Joe's question, what are the brackish water reservoir sizes and volumes in the state of California?
I think they're fairly large. The hard part about them is, for our purposes, we need throughput. I mean, you could use them as a storage vessel if you wanted to recharge them, but then you have to be willing to treat them as the water comes out, and that's the cost. Now, if you have a brackish water reservoir and you're not willing to mine it, then the only amount of water you can get out of it is is what you put into it. So I think in terms of throughput, it's a relatively small volume. Some inland areas in Southern California, that's probably all you've got.
Yeah, there are brackish water basins that are actually filling up, and one of the challenges is actually you have to pump them out
Right.
in order to protect the water quality for the surrounding basins.
Right.
So
Right.
my sense is there's a lot, certainly not enough though, at least in the urban areas, that it will be more than maybe a few percentage points of the supply. Maybe you get 10 or 20% in some areas, but that's probably the most.
My impression of the cost of brackish water desalination is, for the most part, it's probably still too expensive to use it on most crops. But for urban areas, it would make more
Yes,
sense.
it's probably on the order of $600 an acre foot, something close to the Met rate.
My numbers were about $400 an acre foot a few years ago, so it makes sense.
Yeah, but unsubsidized numbers are probably higher.
Yeah.
The real cost, I think, is probably $600. If you build in the cost of brine disposal and all of the things that's why we were successful doing it, is we had built brine disposal a long time ago and had the option for doing it. If you try and build brackish water desalination in many parts of the state, you couldn't do it because you couldn't get rid of the brine.
I guess that's a good point to make. One problem with brine disposal that you have with brackish water desal that you don't have with seawater desal is brackish water is usually further from the sea, and so you've got to remove the salts or stockpile it someplace if you want and find someone that wants to take it.
So help your geologist colleague. Now, two things. First, perfect foresight, which is what an optimization model has within it. And then second, it assumes we make rational decisions. So wouldn't...
Don't you?
No. Rarely. So one would argue then, listening to this, that there's a bias in this, and the bias is toward this is the least expensive that it's likely to be, because we don't always make rational decisions. That's proven.
But we should.
And we don't have perfect foresight, especially in climate change and everything else. So
Geologists don't.
No, we got perfect hindsight. Thank you. We had careers out of it. But so answer that sort of criticism of this kind of approach is that it might be that these costs are actually on the low side.
Sure.
Because of those two factors.
So I prepared a little slide here just for fun. Because
oh, thank you.
might be someone, I had a graduate student a year or so ago that came to a qualifying exam, and she'd clearly done her homework, because you can always tell what a professor is going to ask on a qualifying exam. It's what they usually ask in previous exams. So she'd done her homework. She talked to people that had taken these qualifying exams with all the professors before. And lo and behold, we were in the question phase. He said, oh, yeah, I've got a PowerPoint slide on that. We have nobody to blame but ourselves, So I thought I'd look at this question, along with my normal motto of all models are wrong but some are useful that I stole from George Box. Why might these costs be too low? Which I think is probably the general impression, and I would agree with it. In general, these are optimization models. There's a reason why optimization sounds a lot like optimism. Okay, they're optimistic. We're just trying to do things better. In this case, it has easy water marketing. There's nobody negotiating all this, trying to fight this or that. There's got no territoriality going on in this model. There's no fights over water. There's no lawyers. It's just we're all getting better together here. And we've got money to incentivize everybody to do it, and they're following those incentives. And this perfect foresight, which is in terms of this model sees droughts coming, it sees floods coming, and it's smart about it. I tend to think that the perfect foresight, while it's an easy catchphrase, and it's one that we've popularized ourselves, I think, because we always like to admit our problems. But for a system with as much groundwater storage as this system has, we've found that the effects of perfect foresight are probably like on the order of 20%. When we did some studies down in Southern California, where they had access to a lot of groundwater basins and Colorado River water, the effect of perfect foresight was probably 10% or less. So it's an easy thing for people to sort of catch on to, but I think while it is important, it's not an order of magnitude. You're not going to change the average costs over all wet and dry years by an order of magnitude because of perfect foresight. It's on the order of 20% is what I'd guess. And Andy Draper's dissertation sort of shows this, I think, for some basins. The cost might also be too low because I have this persistent feeling, and Josue's confirmed it again, that we might have a little bit more agricultural land use in 2050 than what we've used in this model, by about 4%, I think. And so that that's real water. That's real water. And I guess I have to also say that I think our representation, I've already said our representation of urban water demand, while I think it's the best in existence, I think it's primitive. Our representation of agricultural water demand has gotten only better since the 2001 results, and it probably still has a ways to go. I think in the last few months, actually, we've made some really remarkable improvements as we've worked much more closely with the Department of Water Resources on this. And that's one of the reasons why I'm pretty sure of this now. We might have higher population growth than we expected, or more of it might occur in the Central Valley than in the coastal areas. And we might have some additional water quality costs other than the ones we have represented in the model, which are fairly modest.
What were your population numbers based on?
We used a 2050 estimate by John Landis from UC Berkeley. It's a high estimate. We used it for a climate change study earlier. It was developed for a climate change study earlier.
Not Department of Finance numbers?
No, when we started these studies, Department of Finance numbers weren't available that far out. I think these have just become available, so we didn't have them for this study. And it's not so much that we didn't have the population, it's that John Landis's results gave us a way of tying that to land use. Because for us, it's very important when you add population to figure out what crops, what agricultural area is displaced, because you're really concerned with that side of water demands as well. So if you just give us a population number, then it's a much harder problem for us. So we like to have our population numbers tied to land use. Costs might also be too high. Oh, I didn't leave anyway, I'll add it. I have another one here. Desalination costs might be a little bit high, but I don't think they're off by a factor of 2. They might be off by $500 an acre foot, but they're not off by $1,000 an acre foot. They could also be too low. I was going through some calculations on a plant in Spain last night, where if I remember my notes correctly and use my notes correctly, the cost for that fairly recent plant just a few years ago, constructed just a few years ago, is about $2,400 an acre foot. So our $2,000 an acre foot that we use here might actually be low. Our water scarcity, water conservation costs, mostly in the urban areas, might be too high. We might have lower population growth than what we projected, and some of the effects on agricultural land retirement that we're just getting into the swap model now a little bit better might also affect some of this. If you have a lot of agricultural land retirement due to salinity or whatever other reasons, that's going to lower the water demands overall, despite this one on the other side. And then the final thing that might occur here is there might be other things that people think of. This system has thousands of very smart people, and they're always thinking of smart things that the model doesn't know about yet. So anyway, yes, does that answer your question, Professor Mount?
Well, no. You sound like an ecologist on the one hand, and on the other hand.
Well, I think we're in.
Something wrong with that?
I think we're probably within about 20-25%. Sort of standard for any engineering calculation. I'd say we're in the ballpark of, if you had to estimate the size of the largest flood in California, I think we probably have a 20 to 50% error on that estimate. I think we're a little tighter than that.
So you did this for no exports, but what about the PC? The PC, all of these.
I think they all apply. This is what's driving it. They're all the same things that are driving both of those sets of model runs.
Construction costs of the peripheral canal are not a major number?
Not in this study. not in this appendix. Remember, we're just looking at how the rest of the system reacts to whatever you did in the delta. In Appendix J, that's when we see the construction costs of the peripheral canal come up. And if we have time in that presentation, I'll bring up the spreadsheet and we can even play with the numbers if you like. Okay. Any other questions? Heckling? No heckling? Nobody here from? Okay.
I guess we should formally ask, is there any additional public comment?
Is any public here?
Well, they're out there
Okay.
in the ether.
Okay.
So what are we doing tomorrow?
Tomorrow we start at 9 with Appendix H, which is on water quality costs, treatment costs. Then Appendix I, which is Josue and Richard on cost to agriculture of salts being exported from the Delta and the changes in salts exported from the Delta. Then I think we go from there to Appendix J. Is that right? Which is the decision analysis that tries to pull all of the stuff together to say, well, which of the 4 strategies is best off for the state of California and for the fish, and the co-equal objectives and non-co-equal objectives and all of that. And then that's followed by lunch. After that, we'll all be very hungry. Everybody's going to bring their appetites tomorrow and a friend. 2 friends, 3 friends. And then we'll have, after lunch, Appendix G, which is on all the things you need to do to implement a peripheral canal. Just when you thought you made a decision, then it gets really bad. And then Appendix A, which is Alan Hannock, talking about regulatory challenges. And then we'll have a science panel on the future of Delta science, public comment, and adjourn. So, thank you all very much.